April 14th, 1814, and the Pemberton Spring Ball glittered with all the false promise of the London season, its chandeliers casting fractured light across dancers who moved like silk through the crowded ballroom, while Eleanor Ashworth stood at the periphery, her pale blue gown a quiet ghost among peacocks, her fingers pressed against the cool stem of a champagne glass she had no intention of drinking. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas had come to her with trembling hands and hollow eyes, since he had whispered the sum that now echoed through her sleepless nights like a death knell, £5,000 owed to men who collected debts not through solicitors, but through broken bones and ruined lives, and she had 6 weeks remaining before they came for him, 6 weeks to find a miracle in a world that had never once looked her way with anything resembling kindness. The yellow roses in their crystal vases perfumed the air with sweetness that felt almost cruel, and Eleanor watched the young debutantes float past in their white muslin, their futures still unmarked by the particular devastation that came from loving someone determined to destroy themselves. She had not come here tonight to dance or to hope. Those luxuries had been stripped from her long ago by the simple mathematics of being 26 and plain and possessed of a modest dowry that diminished further with each passing season. No, she had come because somewhere in this glittering assembly there might be a connection, an old friend of her father's, a distant relation with influence, anyone who might help her save her brother from the consequences of his own foolishness. A ripple of whispers drew her attention toward the far end of the ballroom, and she followed the collective gaze to find its subject, Frederick Sinclair, the Duke of Ravenscroft, standing near the entrance with the particular stillness of a man who observed rather than participated. Even from this distance, Eleanor could see why the ton found him unsettling. There was something in his bearing that suggested depths concealed, secrets kept, and the rumors that swirled around him only added to the mystique. "They say he keeps a mistress somewhere in Cheapside." The whisper came from 2 matrons standing close enough for Eleanor to hear, meets her in secret nearly every evening. The scandal of it, and him unmarried still. Eleanor turned slightly away, uninterested in gossip when her own troubles consumed every waking thought. But the movement brought her closer to another conversation, this one carrying her own name like a stone thrown into still water. Poor Eleanor Ashworth, still haunting these balls like she expects someone to finally notice her. 26 now, is she not? And that face? Well, some women simply are not meant for marriage. The words landed with the precision of old wounds reopened, and Eleanor felt the familiar heat of humiliation climb her throat, even as she kept her expression carefully blank. She had learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. Across the ballroom, through the press of bodies and the swirl of music, she saw the Duke's gaze sweep the room and pause, just for a moment, in her direction, though surely that was merely coincidence, merely the random movement of eyes that would find nothing worth remembering in her unremarkable face. She turned away and touched her mother's pearls at her throat, drawing courage from the cool weight of them, and thought only of Thomas, of the empty chair where he should have been standing beside her, of the letters hidden in her writing desk that counted down the days until everything fell apart. The terrace offered the particular mercy of solitude, and Eleanor stood at its edge, breathing in the cool April air, while the music from the ballroom drifted through the half-open doors like a melody meant for someone else, someone who still believed in the promises such songs whispered of love and partnership and futures filled with warmth. She had fled here without her shawl, and now the chill raised gooseflesh along her bare arms, but she welcomed the discomfort as a distraction from the sharper cold of those overheard words that had settled into her chest like shards of ice. The gardens below stretched into darkness, punctuated by lanterns that cast small pools of golden light across manicured hedges and gravel paths, and she fixed her gaze upon them, rather than allow herself to look back toward the glittering world she had momentarily escaped. The sound of footsteps on stone made her stiffen, and she turned expecting to offer apologies and retreat. But the words died unspoken when she found herself facing the Duke of Ravenscroft himself, his dark evening clothes rendering him nearly one with the shadows, only the signet ring on his hand catching the light from the ballroom behind them. He did not speak immediately, and in that silence Eleanor felt acutely aware of her own ordinariness, of the pale blue gown that had seemed acceptable in her mirror, but now felt like the costume of someone pretending to belong, of her wind-touched hair and the absence of any expression that might be called inviting. "You are Miss Ashworth," he said at last, and it was not a question, but a statement that suggested he had already known before approaching, had perhaps been watching with those perceptive eyes that now studied her face with an intensity she found deeply unsettling. Eleanor managed a curtsy that felt mechanical, wondering what possible interest a duke could have in speaking to her when the ballroom overflowed with diamonds and beauty and prospects far superior to anything she could offer. "I am, Your Grace," she replied, and her voice emerged steadier than she had expected, perhaps because she had long ago abandoned the hope that such conversations might lead anywhere meaningful. He moved to stand beside her at the terrace railing, close enough that she could detect the faint scent of sandalwood, and his gaze swept the darkened gardens before returning to her face with an expression she could not decipher. "You seemed troubled inside," he observed, and there was nothing of polite pretense in his tone, only a directness that startled her with its departure from the careful nothings that comprised most social exchange. Eleanor considered offering one of the pretty deflections a proper lady might employ, but exhaustion and worry had stripped her of the energy for such performances. "I have concerns that occupy my thoughts," she admitted, "nothing that would interest anyone here." His eyes, dark and watchful in the dim light, held hers for a moment that stretched longer than propriety should allow. "You would be surprised, Miss Ashworth. What interests me?" The words hung between them, strange and weighted with something she could not name, and Eleanor felt a peculiar flutter beneath her ribs that she immediately dismissed as meaningless. Men like the Duke of Ravenscroft did not notice women like her, and whatever momentary curiosity had drawn him to this terrace would fade before the night ended, leaving her exactly where she had always been, alone with her troubles and invisible to the world that sparkled just beyond her reach. The morning of April 16th found Eleanor in the sitting room of the Ashworth family home, a modest but respectable residence that had grown quieter with each passing year since their parents had been taken by fever, and she sat beneath the portrait of her mother and father that hung above the cold fireplace, their painted eyes watching over a household that had diminished in both fortune and hope since those brush-strokes had captured them in happier times. She had slept poorly, her dreams fractured by images of yellow roses and dark eyes, and a voice that had spoken to her as though she mattered. But the light of day had restored her usual pragmatism, and she had dismissed the encounter on the terrace as the sort of meaningless moment that a plain spinster might foolishly treasure but should never mistake for anything of substance. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her look up from the needlework she had been pretending to focus upon, and when Thomas appeared in the doorway, her heart clenched at the sight of him, pale and drawn, with shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights matching her own, and a tremor in his hands that he tried unsuccessfully to hide by clasping them behind his back. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice cracked on her name in a way that made her set aside her embroidery and rise to her feet with the particular dread of someone who knows that worse news is coming. He crossed to the chair opposite hers and sat heavily, and for a long moment he said nothing, only stared at the carpet with the expression of a man who has run out of roads and found himself at the edge of a cliff. "I have not told you everything," he finally managed, and Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her, even as she kept her voice steady, and asked him to explain. "The creditors," he continued, his hands now visibly shaking as he spoke. "They are not merely money-lenders or gaming hell proprietors seeking their due. They are connected to a man called Lord Chamberlain, and Eleanor, the things I have heard whispered about what happens to those who cannot pay. The violence, the disappearances, I have been such a fool." Eleanor moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his trembling hands in her own, and she felt the war within herself between the fury at his recklessness and the desperate, consuming love that had protected him since they were children left alone in a world that offered orphans no particular kindness. "Tell me everything," she said, and he did, the words pouring out like poison from a wound, the nights lost to cards and dice, the certainty that luck would turn that never materialized, the mounting debts and the threatening letters she had already discovered hidden in her writing desk, and finally the name that would haunt her in the weeks to come, Lord Chamberlain, spoken with the particular terror reserved for monsters wearing gentlemen's clothing. When he finished, Eleanor rose and walked to the window, looking out at the street where ordinary people passed with ordinary troubles, and she made herself a silent promise that she would find a way to save him, whatever the cost, whatever means presented themselves, because he was all she had left in this world, and she would not lose him to the consequences of his own desperate foolishness. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Lady Greville's drawing room on the afternoon of April 18th presented itself as a sanctuary of refined femininity, with pale lavender walls and delicate Chinese porcelain arranged upon tables draped in cream lace, and Eleanor sat perched upon a settee that was slightly too elegant for comfort, while accepting a cup of tea from her hostess, with hands she hoped did not betray her inner turmoil, for she had come here not out of any genuine desire for social connection, but from the desperate calculation that a well-connected widow might possess knowledge or influence that could somehow be leveraged to save Thomas from the fate that crept closer with each passing day. Lady Lydia Greville wore the soft lavender of half-mourning that had become her signature in the 2 years since her husband's passing, and pearl earrings caught the afternoon light as she tilted her head with an expression of such warm sympathy that Eleanor felt herself wanting to confide everything, despite the voice of caution that whispered from somewhere deep within her chest. Margaret Fairfax sat nearby, her presence a comfort even as her eyes tracked Lady Greville's movements with an assessment that seemed less charitable than Eleanor's own. And when their gazes met briefly, Eleanor saw something like warning in her friend's expression that she chose not to examine too closely, because hope was a commodity she could not afford to scrutinize. "You seem troubled, my dear Miss Ashworth," Lady Greville observed, setting down her own cup with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of appearing concerned. "And I do hope you know that you may speak freely here, for we women must support one another in this world that offers us so little power of our own." Eleanor found herself moved by words that seemed to echo her own isolation, and though she did not reveal the full truth of Thomas's situation, she admitted to family concerns that weighed upon her spirits, watching as Lady Greville nodded with understanding that felt almost maternal. "It is a difficult time for many families," Lady Greville continued, leaning forward as though sharing a confidence, "and one never knows whom to trust, for even those who appear most honorable may harbor secrets that would shock polite society." And here she paused with a meaningful look that made Eleanor's pulse quicken with sudden attention. "I hesitate to speak of it," Lady Greville added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that drew both Eleanor and Margaret closer, despite themselves. "But I have seen things recently that trouble me greatly, things concerning a certain duke, whose reputation for honor may be entirely undeserved, for I myself witnessed him meeting secretly with a woman, late at night, in circumstances that could only suggest an illicit arrangement of the most scandalous nature." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach as the image of the Duke of Ravenscroft rose unbidden in her memory, his dark eyes and direct manner on that terrace, and she thought of how foolishly her heart had fluttered at his attention, how she had allowed herself one brief moment of imagining that such a man might see value in someone like her, and now Lady Greville's words painted him as just another hypocrite hiding corruption beneath a polished exterior, and the disappointment that washed through her was sharper than it had any right to be for a man she had spoken to only once. The evening of April 21st brought Eleanor to the Whitmore Musicale in a gown of sage green that she had chosen without particular care, for her mind was too occupied with the war between memory and suspicion to concern itself with matters of appearance, and she found herself seated near the back of the drawing-room where a soprano of considerable talent performed Italian arias that washed over Eleanor like water over stone, beautiful but unable to penetrate the turmoil that had taken residence in her chest since Lady Greville's poisonous confidences 3 days prior. She had told herself she would not look for him, that the Duke of Ravenscroft meant nothing to her, and that one brief conversation on a terrace did not constitute any sort of connection worth mourning. Yet her eyes betrayed her repeatedly, scanning the assembled guests until they found him standing near the tall windows that overlooked the garden, his dark figure silhouetted against the evening light, in a way that made her breath catch, despite her determination to feel nothing but contempt for a man who apparently conducted secret liaisons while presenting himself as honorable to the world. The soprano reached a particularly soaring passage, and Eleanor forced her attention back to the performance, applauding when others applauded, smiling when smiles seemed required, playing the part of an unremarkable spinster, attending yet another event where she would be neither noticed nor missed. But when the interval came and guests rose to mingle and refresh themselves, she found her careful anonymity shattered by the approach of the very man she had been trying so desperately not to watch. "Miss Ashworth," Frederick said, and his voice carried that same quality of genuine attention that had so unsettled her on the terrace. "I had hoped to find you here," and before she could formulate a response that would convey appropriate distance without revealing the turmoil beneath, he continued with a question that pierced through all her defenses. "I have been thinking of our conversation and wondering whether your brother's situation has improved at all, for you seemed greatly troubled on his behalf." Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her feet as she struggled to reconcile this apparent concern with the image Lady Greville had painted, and she heard herself responding with a coolness that surprised her. "You are kind to inquire, Your Grace, though I cannot imagine why the troubles of my family would occupy any space in your thoughts." She watched his expression shift almost imperceptibly, a flicker of confusion crossing those dark eyes that had seemed so perceptive before, and she wondered if she was imagining the hurt that briefly surfaced before his composure reasserted itself, leaving him regarding her with the careful assessment of someone trying to solve a puzzle whose pieces have suddenly rearranged themselves. "I find myself interested in many things that others might consider beneath notice, Miss Ashworth," he replied quietly, and there was something in his tone that made her want to abandon her suspicions and trust him as she had so briefly on that cool spring evening. But then she remembered Lady Greville's words about midnight meetings and mysterious women, and she inclined her head with distant politeness before excusing herself to find Margaret, leaving him standing alone by the window with an expression she refused to examine too closely, because doing so might crack the righteous certainty she was building like a wall around her wounded heart. The night of April 24th found Eleanor doing something she had never imagined herself capable of, something that would have horrified her mother and scandalized anyone who knew the respectable Miss Ashworth, for she was crouched in a hired carriage on a street no decent woman should know existed, watching the door of a gambling establishment from which her brother had disappeared an hour earlier, her heart pounding with equal measures of fear and desperate determination as fog crept along the cobblestones, still wet from earlier rain, and gas lamps cast pools of sickly yellow light that seemed to make the shadows between them all the darker. She had followed Thomas from their home after hearing him slip out through the servants' entrance, had thrown on her plainest cloak, and instructed the confused driver to follow the hansom cab her brother had hailed. And now she sat in this wretched place, trying to understand the world that had swallowed her brother whole, trying to see for herself what drew him back again and again to these dens of vice, despite knowing they would be his destruction. The door of the establishment opened, and Eleanor pressed herself back against the worn leather seat, expecting to see Thomas emerge, but instead her breath caught in her throat as the Duke of Ravenscroft stepped into the foggy night, his tall figure unmistakable even in the dim light. And he was not alone, but accompanied by a woman of striking beauty who wore an emerald cloak that caught the lamplight like a jewel against the grey murk of the street. Eleanor watched as Frederick leaned close to speak something in the woman's ear, watched as the woman laughed and placed her gloved hand upon his arm with an intimacy that spoke of long familiarity, watched as they moved together toward a waiting carriage with the easy coordination of people who had done this many times before. And she felt something shatter inside her chest that she had not even realized she had been building, some fragile structure of hope that had begun constructing itself without her permission from the moment he had looked at her on that terrace and seen something worth noticing. Lady Greville had been right, Eleanor thought with a bitterness that tasted like ash upon her tongue. He was exactly what the rumors suggested. A man who conducted secret liaisons in disreputable places while presenting a facade of honor to the world. And she had been a fool to feel anything when he asked about Thomas, a fool to lie awake remembering the particular quality of his attention, a fool to imagine that a duke, who could have anyone, would genuinely concern himself with a plain spinster whose only distinction was the depth of her family's troubles. The carriage bearing Frederick and his mysterious companion pulled away into the fog, and Eleanor sat frozen in the darkness, tears she refused to shed, burning behind her eyes as she realized that her grief was not only for the loss of an illusion about one man, but for the confirmation of everything she had always believed about her own insignificance. And when Thomas finally emerged an hour later looking haggard and haunted, she said nothing of what she had witnessed, only instructed the driver to take them home through streets that seemed darker than ever before. The morning of April 25th brought no relief from the images that had burned themselves into Eleanor's mind during the sleepless hours she had spent staring at the canopy of her bed, while rain began to fall against the windows some time before dawn, and when Margaret arrived unannounced shortly after breakfast, finding Eleanor still in her nightdress with shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of a night spent wrestling with demons rather than finding rest, the concern on her friend's face only deepened the ache that had settled in Eleanor's chest like a stone she could not dislodge, no matter how she tried to reason with herself about the foolishness of grieving over a man she barely knew and had no right to feel anything for in the first place. "You look dreadful," Margaret said with the bluntness that Eleanor usually appreciated, but today found almost unbearable. And before Eleanor could deflect with some practiced dismissal, the words began spilling from her lips like water from a broken vessel, the whole terrible story of following Thomas and what she had witnessed outside that gambling establishment, the Duke emerging with that beautiful woman in her emerald cloak, the intimacy of their manner together, the confirmation of everything Lady Greville had suggested, and worse. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly troubled, and when Eleanor finally fell silent, her friend reached across the small table between them to take her hand with a gentleness that threatened to undo what remained of Eleanor's composure. "Eleanor," Margaret said carefully, "are you certain of what you saw? Because there could be explanations you have not considered, and I confess I have never fully trusted Lady Greville's intentions, despite her apparent kindness." But Eleanor shook her head with a violence that surprised them both, for she had seen the woman's hand on his arm, had seen him lean close to speak into her ear, had seen them move together toward that waiting carriage with the ease of long practice, and no amount of alternative explanations could erase the evidence of her own eyes or the way her heart had cracked open in that foggy street while she sat hidden in the shadows like the invisible creature society had always deemed her to be. The pale blue gown she had worn to the Pemberton ball hung visible in her wardrobe, a ghostly reminder of the evening when she had briefly allowed herself to believe that someone of consequence might actually see her, and Eleanor turned away from it with a bitterness that hardened something inside her chest into cold determination. Men like him parade through ballrooms pretending to be honorable while conducting secret affairs in the shadows, she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, flat and certain in a way that left no room for doubt, and someone should know the truth about what the Duke of Ravenscroft really is. Margaret's grip on her hand tightened with what felt like warning, but Eleanor had already made her decision somewhere in the small hours of the morning, and no voice of caution could reach her now through the walls she was building from her own wounded pride and fierce protective anger on behalf of every woman who had ever been deceived by a charming smile and attention that meant nothing. The afternoon of April 27th dawned bright and mercilessly cheerful, as though the heavens themselves were mocking the turmoil that had taken up permanent residence in Eleanor's chest, and she stood in Lady Greville's garden, surrounded by roses in full bloom and influential matrons sipping lemonade beneath a white gazebo, while her heart pounded with the terrible certainty of what she was about to do, for she had dressed carefully this morning in her best day dress of cream muslin with delicate embroidery at the sleeves, had pinned her hair with more care than usual, had armored herself in respectability because she understood that what she was about to say would only be believed if she appeared credible and composed rather than like a woman scorned or a gossip seeking attention. Lady Greville had welcomed her with particular warmth, had guided her toward the cluster of women whose opinions shaped the social landscape of London with the precision of master sculptors, and Eleanor had felt the widow's encouraging hand at the small of her back like a gentle push toward a cliff edge she could not see. The conversation had turned, as it so often did, to the Duke of Ravenscroft and his mysterious behavior, and Lady Greville had looked at Eleanor with an expression of such sympathetic concern as she said that surely Miss Ashworth might have something to contribute to this discussion given her keen powers of observation, and Eleanor had felt the words rising in her throat like bile she could no longer contain. She told them everything, her voice steady, despite the trembling of her hands hidden in the folds of her skirt. Told them about the night she had witnessed the Duke emerging from that disreputable establishment with a beautiful woman in an emerald cloak, told them about the intimacy of their manner together, the way the woman had touched his arm and he had leaned close to whisper in her ear. And she watched as expressions shifted from polite interest to scandalized delight around the circle of upturned faces, drinking in every word like nectar. Lady Pemberton gasped and pressed a hand to her substantial bosom while Mrs. Whitmore exchanged meaningful glances with the Countess of Ashford, and Eleanor felt something hollow opening in her stomach, even as the words continued to pour forth, because she had expected satisfaction, and instead found only a strange numbness spreading through her limbs. Lady Greville's face remained composed throughout, but there was something in her eyes that Eleanor might have recognized as triumph if she had been paying attention to anything beyond the terrible momentum of her own accusations, a glitter of satisfaction that seemed disproportionate to mere gossip confirmed. By the time the garden party ended and carriages began departing through the iron gates, Eleanor knew that what she had unleashed could not be called back, that the whispered conversations already beginning among the departing guests would spread through London's drawing rooms like fire through dry grass, and she told herself that this was justice as she climbed into her own modest carriage, told herself that exposing a hypocrite was righteous even as some small voice buried deep beneath her anger whispered that Margaret had urged caution, and she had not listened, had not wanted to listen, had wanted only to strike back at a world that had shown her how easily hope could be crushed beneath the weight of evidence she had never thought to question. The morning of April 28th brought scandal sheets to every doorstep in fashionable London, their ink still fresh and smelling of vindication as servants carried them on silver trays to breakfast rooms where the previous day's gossip had already taken root and begun to bloom into something monstrous. And Eleanor sat alone in the Ashworth dining room, staring at the words printed in bold type that proclaimed the Duke of Ravenscroft's disgrace, while she waited for the satisfaction she had been certain would come, and found instead only a hollow ache spreading through her chest like spilled tea seeping into white linen. "The Duke of Ravenscroft exposed," the headline screamed, "secret liaison with mysterious widow confirmed by reliable witness." And Eleanor recognized her own accusations transformed into something uglier than she had intended, something permanent and public that could never be unsaid or unprinted, no matter how many times she read the words, hoping they might somehow change. Margaret arrived before noon with a face pale as winter frost, and news that made Eleanor's already unsettled stomach clench with a dread she could not name. For the mysterious woman in the emerald cloak had been identified as Mrs. Clara Hastings, a respectable widow whose late husband had served honourably in the Navy before his death at Trafalgar. And now her name was being dragged through every drawing room in London alongside accusations of being the Duke's paramour, her reputation destroyed, her children's futures compromised, her grief made into public spectacle. The Duke himself had withdrawn entirely from society, his townhouse shuttered, his engagements cancelled, and there were whispers that he had been conducting some manner of important work that had now been abandoned, though the nature of that work remained unclear through the fog of scandal that Eleanor had herself created. She told herself this was justice, that hypocrites deserved exposure, that she had only spoken the truth of what she witnessed. But the words rang hollow even in her own mind as she watched Margaret's expression shift from concern to something closer to fear. Thomas appeared briefly in the doorway, his face gaunt with sleeplessness and worry, and Eleanor realized with sickening clarity that exposing the Duke had done nothing whatsoever to help her brother, that the creditors still circled like wolves waiting for their payment, that the deadline still approached with merciless inevitability, and that she had spent her energy on destruction rather than salvation. There was something wrong with all of this, Margaret said quietly as she folded the scandal sheet and set it aside as though it were contaminated. Something about the way Lady Greville encouraged you to speak, something about how quickly this spread, and I cannot shake the feeling that you have been used for purposes you do not yet understand. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to defend her actions with the righteous certainty that had fueled her at the garden party, but the satisfaction she had expected to feel remained stubbornly absent, replaced by a growing unease that whispered she had made a terrible mistake, and that the consequences of that mistake were only beginning to reveal themselves in ways she had never imagined, and could not yet comprehend. The evening of April 30th found Eleanor alone in the sitting room of the Ashworth home, candles burning low in their holders and casting wavering shadows across the creditors' letters that lay spread upon the writing desk like accusations she could no longer ignore, and Thomas's chair sat empty across from her, because he had taken to spending his nights walking the streets rather than facing the walls of a home that might soon no longer belong to them. And she was staring at nothing when Margaret arrived unannounced, with rain in her hair, and an expression that made Eleanor's heart seize with fresh dread before a single word was spoken. "I have learned something," Margaret said, as she removed her damp cloak and settled into the chair that Thomas should have occupied. "Something you must hear, though I fear it will bring you no comfort." And Eleanor wanted to beg her not to speak, wanted to preserve whatever fragile denial still remained to her. But Margaret had never been one to shield her from difficult truths, and she did not begin now. "The Duke of Ravenscroft," Margaret continued, in a voice barely above a whisper, as though the walls themselves might carry tales, "was not conducting an affair with Mrs. Hastings or anyone else. He was conducting an investigation. Eleanor, a secret and careful investigation into the gambling ring that has destroyed so many young men of good families. And Mrs. Hastings was helping him because her own nephew was among the victims, ruined and driven to take his own life last winter. And together they had been gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to expose the men responsible and free their victims from debt and destruction." Eleanor felt the words strike her like physical blows, each revelation another wound opening in her chest, and she gripped the arm of her chair so tightly that her knuckles went white as Margaret continued speaking in that terrible, gentle voice that carried information Eleanor did not want to receive, but could not stop hearing. "He had already helped a dozen young men," Margaret said, "had quietly paid their debts and given them fresh starts without asking for recognition or repayment. And there were whispers that he had his eye on your brother's situation, that Thomas was on a list of those to be approached once the investigation was complete. But now that investigation lies in ruins, and the men responsible remain free and powerful, while the Duke's reputation is destroyed, and Mrs. Hastings has fled London in disgrace, and the young men who might have been saved will find no salvation coming." The family portrait above the fireplace seemed to watch Eleanor with her parents' painted eyes as the full weight of what she had done settled upon her shoulders like a burial shroud. And she understood now why satisfaction had never come, understood that she had not exposed a hypocrite at all, but had instead destroyed the one man who might have saved her brother, had shattered something good and necessary because she had been too angry and too hurt and too willing to believe the worst. And Lady Greville had known exactly what strings to pull to make her dance toward catastrophe while believing herself righteous. The afternoon of May the 2nd brought Eleanor to the doorstep of the Duke of Ravenscroft's London residence, with rain soaking through her pelisse and terror making her hands shake so badly she could barely lift the knocker. And she stood there for a long moment before she found the courage to announce her presence to a household she had single-handedly brought to ruin. And when the butler opened the door, his expression shifted from professional neutrality to something colder when he recognized her face from the scandal sheets that had made her both famous and infamous in equal measure. But she lifted her chin and asked to see his grace, and refused to leave until he agreed to receive her, even though every fibre of her being screamed at her to flee back to the safety of anonymity, where she would never have to face the consequences of her actions in the flesh. The study into which she was finally admitted spoke of a man preparing for departure, with trunks half-packed in the corners and books pulled from shelves and papers stacked in boxes as though an entire life was being dismantled and stored away. And Frederick Sinclair stood by the rain-streaked window with his back to her when she entered, his posture rigid with a tension she could feel across the length of the room. And when he turned to face her, his eyes held none of the warmth she remembered from the terrace at the Pemberton ball, only a weariness so profound it made her heart clench with fresh guilt. "You have considerable courage, Miss Ashworth," he said in a voice flat as still water. "Or perhaps considerable foolishness, coming here after what you have done." And Eleanor absorbed the words like blows she deserved. standing straight despite the trembling in her knees, because she would not allow herself the comfort of collapse when she had come to face judgment. "I know what you were doing," she said, her voice emerging steadier than she expected. "I know about the investigation, and Mrs. Hastings, and the young men you were trying to save. And I know that I destroyed it all because I was angry and afraid and too willing to believe the worst of a man who had shown me nothing but kindness. And I have not come to make excuses, because there are none that would suffice. Only to tell you that I am sorry with every piece of my wretched heart, and to beg you, not for myself but for my brother, who had no part in my foolishness, to find some way to help him still, even though I deserve nothing but your contempt." Frederick studied her for a long moment with those penetrating eyes that had once seen something worthwhile in her on a moonlit terrace, and she watched emotions flicker across his face, anger and grief, and something else she could not name, before he gestured to a chair and said quietly, "Sit down, Miss Ashworth, and tell me exactly what Lady Greville said to you, because I begin to suspect you were not the architect of my destruction, but merely the weapon someone else chose to wield." Eleanor told him everything then, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam as she recounted Lady Greville's sympathetic manner and carefully placed confidences, the way the widow had expressed such concern about the Duke's mysterious night-time activities, and the beautiful woman seen entering and leaving his carriage, the gentle suggestions that perhaps someone ought to protect innocent young ladies from a man who clearly had no honor, despite his title and fortune. And as she spoke, Eleanor watched Frederick's expression shift from anger to something more complex, a kind of grim recognition that told her he was fitting pieces together that she could not see. "Lady Greville is Lord Chamberlain's creature," he said quietly when she finished. "She has been feeding information to him for years, identifying targets and helping to lure young men into the gambling hells where they are systematically destroyed, and I should have realized she would find a way to strike at me when I got too close to exposing her master. But I never imagined she would use someone like you as her weapon." The words, "someone like you," hung in the air between them, and Eleanor felt their weight. Understanding that he meant someone earnest and protective and desperate enough to believe the worst when it seemed to confirm her fears, and she bowed her head in acknowledgement of how perfectly she had been manipulated, how her love for Thomas had been turned into a blade aimed at the very man who might have saved him. "I was a fool," she said simply, "and I have no right to ask anything of you after what I have done, but my brother is innocent of my crimes, and he has only 3 weeks before Lord Chamberlain's men come for him, and if there is any mercy left in your heart, I beg you to direct it toward Thomas, even if you can never forgive me." Frederick was silent for a long moment, and the clock on the mantel chimed 5 times, marking the hour while Eleanor sat with her hands trembling around her reticule, and her heart beating so loudly she was certain he must hear it. And when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its coldness, though wariness remained in every syllable. "You came here expecting my hatred," he observed, watching her with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see through every defense she might raise. "And yet you came anyway, not for yourself, but for your brother. And you have offered no excuses, no attempts to shift blame, only accountability, and a plea for someone other than yourself." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, despite the tears that threatened to fall. "Thomas is all I have left in this world," she said, "and I would walk through fire for him. I would endure any humiliation, any punishment you deemed fitting, if it meant he might have a chance at the life our parents would have wanted for him, and if destroying me would give you satisfaction, then I offer myself willingly, only spare him." Something shifted in Frederick's expression then, something that looked almost like recognition, and he leaned forward slightly, as though seeing her truly for the first time since she had entered his study, and when he spoke again, his voice held a note that had not been there before. "I believe, Miss Ashworth, that you and I have more in common than either of us realized," he said slowly, "and I find myself unwilling to let Lady Greville claim another victory by driving away someone who might yet prove an ally in finishing what she thought she had destroyed." The morning of May 5th dawned with a cruelty that seemed designed to mock Eleanor's despair, for the sun streamed through the windows of the Ashworth home with golden brilliance, and the garden beyond displayed spring flowers in riotous bloom, as though the world had not tilted on its axis and threatened to crush everything she held dear. And she sat in the modest sitting room with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on the family portrait above the mantel, where her parents gazed down at her with expressions she could no longer read as pride or disappointment, while across the room Thomas stood by the window in clothes that hung looser on his frame than they had mere weeks ago, his youth seeming to have fled in the time since his debts had consumed their lives. "I have sold the horses," he said quietly, without turning to face her, "and Father's watch went yesterday to a dealer in Cheapside, who gave me far less than it was worth, but I could not bargain when I have no leverage. And still, it is not enough, Eleanor. It will never be enough. And I think perhaps the kindest thing I can do for you is turn myself over to them before the deadline, so that you might have a chance to rebuild something from the wreckage I have made of our family." Eleanor rose from her chair with a swiftness that startled them both, and crossed to her brother's side, taking his thin hands in hers and holding them tightly as though she could anchor him to hope through sheer force of will. And she said fiercely that she would not allow him to surrender, that they had 1 week still, and she had not yet exhausted every possibility, though even as she spoke the words she knew they rang hollow, because the one man who might have helped them had every reason to wish them both destroyed. The knock at the door came just as the clock struck 10, and Eleanor's heart seized in her chest when the maid entered bearing a silver salver with a letter upon it, a letter sealed with deep crimson wax, pressed with an imprint she recognized instantly as the Ravenscroft crest, and her fingers trembled so violently as she broke the seal that Thomas had to steady her wrist while she unfolded the heavy paper and read the words written in a bold, decisive hand that requested her presence at the home of Miss Margaret Fairfax the following afternoon to discuss a matter of mutual interest and potential benefit to her family. "He has not abandoned us," Eleanor whispered, the words emerging like a prayer she had not dared to speak aloud, and Thomas looked at her with confusion and dawning hope warring in his hollow eyes as she clutched the letter to her chest and felt something that had been frozen inside her begin to thaw, something that whispered, perhaps redemption was possible after all. Perhaps the Duke had seen something in her desperate honesty that outweighed his justified anger. Perhaps there was still a path forward through the darkness that did not end in her brother's destruction and her own eternal shame. The afternoon of May 6th found Eleanor seated in Margaret Fairfax's modest but cheerful drawing-room, with her heart pounding against her ribs and her eyes fixed upon the Duke of Ravenscroft, who stood by the window with documents spread across the table before him, and Margaret moved quietly about the room, pouring tea that no one would drink, while Frederick explained in measured tones the plan that had taken shape in his mind during the sleepless nights since Eleanor's confession. A plan that would require her to do something far more difficult than simply apologizing for her mistakes, something that would demand she become the very weapon that Lady Greville had unwittingly forged and turn it back upon its creators with devastating precision. "You must return to Lady Greville's circle," Frederick said without looking at Eleanor. "You must pretend that nothing has changed, that you still believe yourself her friend and confidant, and you must gain access to Lord Chamberlain's private. Study where he keeps the records of every young man he has destroyed, and every debt he has manufactured through rigged games and false promises." And Eleanor felt her breath catch at the magnitude of what he was asking, even as something fierce and determined rose within her chest, and whispered that this was her chance to undo the damage she had caused. Margaret paused in her movements and looked between them with concern evident in her gentle features, asking whether such a course was not terribly dangerous for Eleanor, given that Lady Greville was no fool, and Lord Chamberlain was known to deal harshly with those who crossed him. But Frederick's jaw tightened, and he said that he would be present at every event, watching from a distance, ready to intervene if anything went wrong, and the way his eyes finally met Eleanor's as he spoke those words sent an unexpected warmth spreading through her, despite the gravity of their discussion. "I will do it," Eleanor said, before doubt could take hold. "I will do whatever is necessary to bring them down and save Thomas and restore what I have broken." And Frederick studied her face for a long moment, with an expression she could not quite decipher, before nodding slowly and gesturing for her to join him at the table, where maps of Lord Chamberlain's residence lay alongside lists of names and dates that represented years of careful investigation, now requiring a new approach. They worked together through the afternoon hours, shoulders nearly touching as they bent over documents, voices low and intent as they refined the details of what must be done, and Eleanor found herself acutely aware of every accidental brush of his hand against hers, every moment when his breath stirred the hair at her temple as he leaned close to point out some crucial detail, and she recognized with startling clarity that something had shifted between them, that the man who had every reason to despise her was instead looking at her with something that resembled respect, and perhaps even the fragile beginnings of trust. When Margaret finally insisted they must stop before the servants began to gossip about the length of Eleanor's visit, Frederick walked her to the door and took her hand in his for just a moment longer than propriety demanded, and said quietly that he was glad she had come to him that day in his study, that her courage in facing him had shown him the truth of her character more clearly than any words could have done. The evening of May 10th arrived with a weight that pressed against Eleanor's chest as she stood before the mirror in her bedchamber and fastened the final button of her deep burgundy gown, a color she had chosen deliberately for its boldness, for its declaration that she was no longer the invisible spinster who faded into wallpaper, but a woman with purpose and fire burning beneath her composed exterior. And when she descended the stairs to the waiting carriage that would deliver her to Lord Chamberlain's card party, she carried within her bodice a small, folded piece of paper, bearing the layout of his study that Frederick had sketched from memory during their planning sessions, her heart hammering with equal measures of terror and determination as the horses carried her toward the lion's den. Lady Greville greeted her arrival with a smile that Eleanor now recognized as the expression of a predator pleased to see its prey return willingly to the trap, and she forced herself to return the gesture with warmth she did not feel, while allowing the widow to guide her through the glittering rooms, where gentlemen clustered around card tables covered in green baize, and fortunes changed hands with the turn of painted cards. And somewhere among these elegant vipers lurked the man who had destroyed her brother, and countless others like him. She felt Frederick's presence before she saw him, a prickling awareness along her spine that drew her gaze across the crowded room to where he stood in conversation with Lord Ashworth, his dark evening clothes impeccable and his expression betraying nothing of their shared purpose. And when their eyes met for the briefest moment, she read in his steady gaze both warning and encouragement that steadied her nerves like a hand pressed against the small of her back. The opportunity came when Lady Greville was drawn into animated conversation with a duchess whose diamonds caught the candlelight like captured stars, and Eleanor slipped away with murmured excuses about needing air, her slippers silent on the polished floors as she navigated the corridors toward the study that Frederick had described, her fingers trembling only slightly as she tested the handle and found it unlocked just as he had predicted it would be during the busy hours of the party. The study smelled of tobacco and leather and secrets, and Eleanor moved swiftly to the desk, where letters lay in careless piles that spoke of Lord Chamberlain's arrogance, his certainty that no one would dare intrude upon his private domain, and her eyes scanned the documents until she found what she sought, letters bearing names and figures that proved the systematic destruction of young men through manufactured debts and rigged games. And she had just tucked the most damning pages into her bodice when footsteps sounded in the corridor outside. Her heart stopped and then raced wildly as the door handle began to turn. But before panic could freeze her completely, a voice she recognized as Frederick's called out from somewhere nearby, asking Lord Chamberlain about a hand of cards, and the footsteps retreated as Eleanor pressed herself against the wall and breathed prayers of gratitude into the darkness. And when she finally emerged, minutes later with evidence burning against her skin, she found Frederick watching her from across the room with something fierce and proud glowing in his eyes. The night of May 12th wrapped London in sheets of rain that drummed against the roof of Frederick's carriage as it carried them through darkened streets toward the safety of Margaret's home, where Eleanor would be delivered with reputation intact and evidence secured against her racing heart. And in the golden glow of the carriage lanterns, she found herself studying the Duke's profile as he gazed out the rain-streaked window. This man she had wronged so terribly, and who had somehow found it within himself, not only to forgive, but to trust her with the very mission she had nearly destroyed. And when he turned and caught her watching him, she did not look away as she might have done mere weeks ago, but instead held his gaze with a boldness that surprised them both. "You were magnificent tonight," Frederick said quietly, and the words settled into the space between them like something precious and unexpected, his voice carrying none of the cold formality that had marked their earliest encounters, but instead a warmth that made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat, and she found herself smiling despite the danger they had navigated, despite the evidence still pressed against her skin, despite everything that remained uncertain and perilous in the days ahead. "I was terrified," she admitted, "but I kept thinking of Thomas and of all the young men whose lives have been destroyed, and I kept thinking of you standing across that room watching over me, and somehow that made it possible to do what needed to be done." And as she spoke, she realized she had removed her gloves at some point during the evening, and her bare hands lay pale against the dark fabric of her skirts, vulnerable in a way that felt suddenly significant. Frederick's eyes dropped to her hands, and something shifted in his expression, something that made the air inside the carriage feel charged with possibility. And when he reached across the narrow distance between them and took her fingers in his own, Eleanor felt the touch travel through her entire body, like lightning illuminating a darkened landscape. "Your hands are cold," he murmured, but he did not release them, instead cradling them between his palms with a tenderness that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. And she wondered how she had ever believed this man capable of the callous behavior she had accused him of, how she had allowed poisoned whispers to blind her to the truth of his character that had been evident from their very first meeting on that moonlit terrace. "I never thought," Frederick began, then stopped himself and shook his head with something that might have been wonder or frustration at his own inability to find adequate words. "I never imagined when you came to my study that day, broken with guilt and asking nothing for yourself, that I would find myself feeling—" And again he stopped, his thumb tracing absent patterns across her knuckles while rain continued its percussion overhead, and the carriage swayed gently through the London night. Eleanor waited, barely breathing, watching emotions play across his features that she had once thought carved from marble, and finding instead a man struggling with feelings as overwhelming and unexpected as her own. And she understood in that moment that whatever happened with Lord Chamberlain and Lady Greville and Thomas, and all the tangled threads of scandal and redemption, something had taken root between them that would not easily be dismissed or forgotten. The Duchess of Lennox's ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of May 15th, their flames reflected in crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls above the assembled cream of London society. And Eleanor stood at the entrance feeling the weight of everything that would unfold this night, pressing against her ribs as she smoothed the skirts of her gown, a deep sapphire silk that Margaret had insisted upon and that made her feel like someone entirely different from the invisible spinster who had attended the Pemberton ball just 1 month ago. Though in truth, she supposed she was different now, transformed by guilt and redemption, and something else she dared not name, that fluttered in her chest whenever Frederick's eyes found hers across a crowded room. He was already present when she arrived, positioned near the tall windows that overlooked the torchlit gardens, and when their gazes met, she read in his expression both the gravity of their shared mission and something warmer beneath it, something that made her pulse quicken even as she forced herself to look away and perform the role of ordinary guest rather than conspirator. Lord Chamberlain held court near the refreshment tables, his silver hair gleaming and his manner exuding the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, surrounded by the very young gentlemen whose futures he had stolen through rigged cards and manufactured debts. And Eleanor felt hatred rise in her throat like bile as she watched him laugh at some witty remark, while Thomas sat at home preparing to face debtor's prison for crimes this elegant monster had orchestrated. Lady Greville appeared at Eleanor's elbow with a smile that no longer fooled her, murmuring pleasantries about the decorations and the music, and the Duchess's famous hospitality, and Eleanor returned the smile with one equally false while her mind catalogued the placement of every person who mattered to the evening's plan. The magistrate, Sir William Harcourt, who stood near the orchestra having been quietly informed of what evidence would be presented, the young Lord Whitmore, whose testimony Frederick had secured, the doors through which there would be no easy escape once the trap was sprung. Frederick moved through the crowd with purpose disguised as social obligation, pausing to exchange words with gentlemen and bow over ladies' hands. But Eleanor tracked his progress toward Lord Chamberlain, with her heart hammering against her stays, knowing that within the hour everything would change, that the man who had destroyed so many lives would finally face justice, and that her own part in nearly preventing this outcome would be redeemed through its ultimate success. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and couples began to fill the dance floor in swirls of silk and superfine, and Eleanor watched Frederick approach Lord Chamberlain with documents visible in his hand, watched the older man's expression shift from confusion to recognition, to something that might have been fear, and she understood that the moment had arrived, that all their planning and danger and tentative trust had led to this single crystalline instant when truth would shatter the comfortable lies that society had built around a predator in evening clothes. The ballroom fell silent in spreading ripples as Frederick's voice carried across the space with the authority of a man who had spent months gathering evidence against a predator hiding behind silk cravats and silver hair. And Eleanor watched Lord Chamberlain's face transform from confusion to fury to something that looked very much like fear as the Duke produced document after document detailing the rigged games and manufactured debts and ruined young men whose lives had been stolen to feed one man's greed, and she felt her heart swell with something fierce and triumphant as society's most powerful figures turned their gazes upon the villain who had operated so brazenly among them. Sir William Harcourt stepped forward with the gravity of his office, his magistrate's authority lending weight to every accusation Frederick levelled, and young Lord Whitmore found his voice at last to tell the assembled guests how he had been lured and trapped and threatened with destruction until the Duke of Ravenscroft had offered him a way out, had believed him when no one else would, and Eleanor understood that this moment was the culmination of everything Frederick had worked for, everything she had nearly destroyed, everything they had rebuilt together from the ashes of her terrible mistake. Lady Greville attempted to slip toward the doors, but Margaret Fairfax materialized in her path with a smile that held no warmth, and Eleanor felt a grim satisfaction at seeing the woman who had manipulated her so thoroughly finally facing consequences for her treachery, for the poison she had poured into Eleanor's ears and the innocent reputations she had helped destroy in service to Lord Chamberlain's schemes. The orchestra had stopped playing, and the dancers had abandoned the floor, and every eye in the Duchess of Lennox's magnificent ballroom was fixed upon the drama unfolding near the windows, and Eleanor found herself moving toward Frederick without conscious decision, drawn by something stronger than propriety or caution, needing to stand beside him as he completed the work that had cost him so much. He turned as she approached, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch, gratitude and admiration, and something deeper that made her pulse race even amid the chaos erupting around them as Lord Chamberlain shouted. Denials and Lady Greville wept theatrical tears, and Sir William Harcourt called for constables. "You did this," Frederick said quietly, his words meant for her alone amid the tumult. "You made this possible." And Eleanor shook her head because she knew the truth was more complicated, knew that she had nearly prevented this night from ever happening. But he caught her hand and held it firmly, and she understood that he was offering her not just forgiveness but partnership, not just absolution but a future. "Thomas," she whispered, and Frederick nodded, his fingers tightening around hers, already arranged. The debts will be forgiven as evidence of the scheme. And the tears that spilled down Eleanor's cheeks were tears of relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse, like surfacing after weeks beneath dark water into air and light and hope. The constables arrived within the quarter hour, and Lord Chamberlain was escorted from the Duchess of Lennox's ballroom with his wrists bound and his silver head bowed in a posture of defeat that Eleanor suspected she would remember for the rest of her days. And as the doors closed behind him and the assembled guests erupted into a cacophony of shocked whispers and excited speculation, she became aware that Frederick had not released her hand, and that she had no desire whatsoever for him to do so, this connection between them feeling like the only solid thing in a world that had tilted on its axis and rearranged itself into something entirely new. The orchestra, apparently deciding that music was the appropriate response to scandal, struck up another waltz, and slowly, tentatively, couples began to return to the dance floor, as if determined to prove that society could absorb even this disruption into its glittering routines. But Eleanor could not imagine joining them, could not imagine doing anything except standing here beside Frederick, while the magnitude of what they had accomplished together settled into her bones like warmth after a long winter. Lady Greville had been taken away as well, her theatrical tears giving way to venomous accusations that no one seemed inclined to believe, and Margaret appeared at Eleanor's side with a smile of fierce satisfaction that reminded Eleanor why she had been blessed with such a friend, someone who had never stopped believing in her, even when Eleanor had stopped believing in herself. "Your brother," Margaret said softly, touching Eleanor's arm, and Eleanor nodded, because she understood what her friend was not saying, that Thomas was free now, that the debts manufactured to destroy him would be forgiven along with those of every other young man Lord Chamberlain had ensnared, that her family would survive this spring after all, and the relief was so vast she thought she might shatter from the force of it. Frederick turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding something she was almost afraid to name, and when he spoke his voice was pitched for her ears alone, despite the curious glances being cast in their direction from every corner of the ballroom. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was a slight roughness to his tone that made her heart stutter in her chest. "I find myself in the unprecedented position of not knowing what to say," and Eleanor might have laughed at the absurdity of the Duke of Ravenscroft, rendered speechless if she had not been struggling with the same affliction. her usual facility with words having abandoned her entirely in the face of this moment. They stood together amid the swirling dancers and the glittering chandeliers and the hungry eyes of a society that would be discussing this night for years to come. And Eleanor understood that something had shifted between them that could not be shifted back, that the partnership forged in desperation and guilt and the shared pursuit of justice had become something else entirely. Something that made her pulse race and her cheeks flush, and her carefully maintained resignation about her prospects seem like a relic from another lifetime. Another Eleanor who had not yet learned that transformation was possible, that redemption could lead to places she had never dared to imagine. The days following Lord Chamberlain's arrest passed in a blur of interviews with magistrates and tearful reunions and a constant stream of visitors to the modest Ashworth home, and Eleanor found herself transformed in the eyes of society from invisible spinster to unlikely heroine, a shift that left her disoriented and slightly suspicious of the same people who had whispered cruel things about her at the Pemberton ball just weeks before, though she supposed she could not blame them entirely for their fickleness when she herself had proven capable of such catastrophic misjudgment. Thomas had wept when she told him the debts were forgiven, had held her so tightly she thought her ribs might crack. And she had wept too, all the fear and desperation and guilt of the past weeks pouring out of her until she felt hollowed and clean, ready to begin again. Frederick called upon her the afternoon of May 18th, arriving at the Ashworth home with a bouquet of yellow roses that made her breath catch because she remembered the crystal vases at the Pemberton ball, remembered standing alone in that glittering room believing herself invisible. And she understood that he remembered too, that he was telling her something with this choice of flower that went beyond mere courtesy. They walked in the small garden behind her home, Thomas having been persuaded by Margaret to make himself scarce, and the spring air was soft and warm and filled with bird song, and Eleanor thought she had never been so aware of another person's presence, of the precise distance between his shoulder and hers, of the way his voice seemed to resonate in her chest when he spoke. "I have been thinking," Frederick said, and then stopped, and Eleanor watched his profile as he struggled with words that seemed to cost him considerable effort about what comes next, about what I want my life to become now that this work is finished. She waited, her heart beating so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it, and when he turned to face her, his dark eyes held none of their usual composure, only a vulnerability that made him look younger and infinitely dear to her. "I thought I knew what I wanted," he continued. "I thought justice would be enough, that bringing down men like Chamberlain would fill whatever hollow place existed inside me. But I was wrong. Eleanor, I was so terribly wrong because nothing has ever filled that space the way you do. Nothing has ever made me feel as complete as standing beside you in that ballroom while everything we built together came to fruition." He reached for her hands, and she gave them willingly, feeling the warmth of his fingers closing around hers, and she understood that they stood at the threshold of something vast and terrifying and wonderful, something she had never dared to imagine for herself in all those years of resignation and careful management of expectations. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you," he said softly, "not after everything that has passed between us." But Eleanor shook her head because she could not bear to hear him speak of rights when what existed between them transcended such calculations entirely, when she loved him with a ferocity that frightened her.